There are moments in history that split the world in two, a before and an after. Moments so decisive that even centuries later their echoes still reverberate through the walls of cities, through the prayers of millions, and through the conscience of those who dared to understand what truly happened. October 2, 1187, the gates of Jerusalem open, not with a massacre, not with the screams of the dying, but with the measured sound of boots on ancient stone, and with a silence that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. A man enters the city that three of the world's greatest faiths call sacred, and he does so without killing its inhabitants. His name was Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The world would come to know him as Saladin. But who was this man, truly? How did a Kurdish boy born as a refugee on a dark night in Mesopotamia become the sultan who changed the fate of the holy city? And why did he choose mercy in a century that understood only fire and sword? The answers are more complex, more human, and far more surprising than history books have ever dared to tell. This is the untold truth behind the conquest of Jerusalem. He was born the same night his family was forced to flee. The year was 1137. In the fortress town of Tikrit, on the banks of the Tigris River in what is now Iraq, a Kurdish military commander named Naj al-Din Ayyub was packing everything he owned in the darkness. His brother had killed a man of influence, and exile was the only alternative to death. His wife was pregnant, and as the family crossed out of Tikrit under cover of night, she gave birth. That child was Saladin. He came into the world as a refugee, belonging to no fixed soil, son of a family that survived by loyalty and military service under more powerful lords. His people were Kurds, not Arab, not Turkish, not Persian, minorities in a world dominated by those very powers. From his earliest days, Saladin understood what it meant to be an outsider navigating courts of intrigue. He grew up in Baalbek, in the green Bekaa Valley of what is now Lebanon, surrounded by the imposing ruins of Roman temples that still towered above the medieval city. Later, his family moved to Damascus, one of the great centers of Islamic civilization, a city of gardens, covered markets overflowing with silk and spices, scholars debating theology in candlelit rooms, and political conspiracies that could end a life before dawn. Damascus shaped Saladin. He studied the Quran. He learned Arabic, his own Kurdish tongue, and probably Turkish. He became an accomplished horseman, a hawk hunter, a polo player, and he absorbed, above all else, an understanding that power in this world was held together not only by force, but by legitimacy, religious, political, and personal. His formal military career began under his uncle Shirkuh, a commander of fierce reputation who served the Zengid dynasty. It was Shirkuh who would take the young Saladin into the heart of the most complex political arena of the 12th century, Egypt. The Egypt Saladin entered in 1164 was a crumbling empire. The Fatimid Caliphate, Shia in doctrine and ancient in prestige, was collapsing from within. Its caliph was a teenager. Its viziers murdered each other for power. And circling around it like wolves, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem watched and waited for the moment to strike. Saladin watched too. He observed everything. And when his uncle Shirkuh died unexpectedly in 1169, reportedly from overeating, history's most undignified exit for a warrior, the court that had dismissed the young Saladin as harmless found itself facing a man who had already mapped every corridor of power. He was appointed Vizier of Egypt at the age of 31. The courtiers believed he would be easy to control. They had never been more wrong. Within 2 years, he had abolished the Fatimid Caliphate, returned Egypt to Sunni orthodoxy under the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad, replaced the key positions of government with men loyal to him alone, and built the legendary citadel of Cairo, the fortress that still defines the skyline of that city today. He had transformed from tag-along nephew into the master of the wealthiest nation in the Islamic world. But Saladin was not satisfied with wealth. He was haunted by a memory that was not even his own, the memory of 1099. In that year, the Knights of the First Crusade had taken Jerusalem by storm. Contemporary chronicles described streets running ankle-deep with blood. Muslims and Jews alike were slaughtered without distinction. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam, was used as a stable. The Dome of the Rock was desecrated, and Christendom celebrated. That wound had never healed, and Saladin understood that it would never heal until it was answered. After the death of his patron Nur al-Din in 1174, Saladin moved methodically. He was not a man of impulsive passion, he was a strategist. Through a combination of military campaigns and calculated diplomatic marriages, including his marriage to Nur al-Din's own widow, which gave him legitimacy through two ruling dynasties at once, he extended his control over Syria, northern Mesopotamia, Yemen, and the lands surrounding the Crusader states. By 1186, he had accomplished something that had seemed impossible. The fragmented, feuding Muslim world had been unified under a single banner, his banner. The Kingdom of Jerusalem stood in the middle of this new reality, surrounded on all sides. And inside that kingdom, a single reckless man was about to light the fuse that would detonate everything. His name was Reynald of Chatillon, and he was, by most accounts, the most dangerous man in the Holy Land, not because of his military genius, but because of his utter contempt for consequences. A French knight who had arrived in the East during the Second Crusade and decided to stay and make his fortune, Reynald had spent 15 years in a Muslim prison and emerged from it not humbled, but hardened and angrier than ever. He was granted the lordship of Ultra-Jourdain, the desert territories beyond the Jordan River. From his castle of Kerak, he watched the trade routes connecting Egypt to Syria, and he raided them again and again. He broke truce after truce, attacking caravans protected by formal agreements, pirating Muslim ships in the Red Sea, once launching a naval raid so audacious it came within striking distance of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina themselves. Each time Saladin had sent envoys. Each time the Kingdom of Jerusalem apologized but did nothing. Each time Saladin had absorbed the provocation and waited. But in late 1186, Reynald struck a caravan so large and so clearly protected by treaty that even his own king could not ignore it. A massive merchant convoy, traveling peacefully through Frankish-controlled lands under formal safe conduct, was attacked, its guards killed, its merchants taken hostage. Saladin sent envoys to Reynald, who refused to even receive them. He sent them to King Guy of Lusignan, who agreed the attack was wrong, but was so dependent on Reynald's political support that he did nothing. Saladin swore an oath before God he would kill Reynald of Chatillon with his own hands. The trap was now being set. In the summer of 1187, Saladin assembled the largest army he had ever led. Estimates range between 25,000 and 30,000 men, and crossed the Jordan River. He laid siege to Tiberias, where the wife of Count Raymond of Tripoli was trapped inside the citadel with a small garrison. The Kingdom of Jerusalem mobilized in response. King Guy of Lusignan gathered an army of approximately 20,000 men at the Springs of Sephoria, the largest Crusader army ever assembled. They were strong, they were well supplied, and they had water. Critically, they had water. Count Raymond of Tripoli, who knew this land better than almost any man alive, counseled patience. He warned King Guy with extraordinary clarity. Saladin was setting a trap.
To march across the open plateau between Sephoria and Tiberias in the summer heat was to court destruction. His own wife was besieged in Tiberias, and even he argued for caution. "Leave Tiberias to its fate for now," he said. "Saladin cannot maintain a siege indefinitely. His army would need to disperse." Raymond was right, and it would not matter. Gerard de Ridefort, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, argued loudly for immediate attack. Reynald of Chatillon, the man whose actions had started the war, shouted Raymond down and accused him of cowardice. Guy of Lusignan, a king of uncertain character pressed between powerful and opposing advisors, agonized through the night. Then, in the worst decision of his life, he gave the order to march. On July 3, 1187, the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem abandoned the springs of Sephoria and moved out onto the arid volcanic plateau under the summer sun of the Levant. The heat was merciless, the terrain was rocky and bare, and Saladin's cavalry harassed the column every step of the way, not to destroy it, but to slow it, to exhaust it, to push it away from any source of water. By afternoon, men and horses were suffering. The column's commanders called a halt miles short of Tiberias. That night, camped without water under a sky thick with stars, the army of Jerusalem heard the enemy celebrating on the hills around them. Then, in the darkness, Saladin's men set fire to the dry grass. The smoke drifted into the Crusader camp. Horses panicked, men choked and prayed. Dawn on July 4th brought no relief. When the exhausted, thirst-maddened army tried to resume its march toward water, it found Saladin's forces already in position across every path. The battle that unfolded near the volcanic twin peaks, known as the Horns of Hattin, was less a military engagement than a systematic destruction. Saladin's archers fired through the smoke that continued to rise from the burning grass. Desperate cavalry charges broke against Muslim lines that simply opened to let them through, then closed again. The infantry, mad with thirst, collapsed and surrendered in their thousands. The king's royal tent was captured, and with it, the army of Jerusalem.
By the time it was over, King Guy of Lusignan was a prisoner. The Grand Master of the Templars was a prisoner. And Reynald of Chatillon, the man who had started it all, sat inside Saladin's tent in the late afternoon heat, having survived the battle that his arrogance had caused. Saladin offered King Guy a goblet of water, the traditional Muslim gesture of mercy, signifying that the prisoner's life would be spared. Guy drank, then passed the cup to Reynald. Saladin, according to the chroniclers, struck it from the man's hands. He had not offered Reynald water. He was not bound by any rules of hospitality toward him. Then he reminded Reynald, before witnesses, of every truce he had broken, every oath he had violated, every caravan he had plundered. Reynald replied that kings had always acted thus, that he had done nothing unusual. Saladin drew his sword, or gave the signal to his guards. The historical accounts differ on the exact detail, but not on the outcome. Reynald of Chatillon died that day, his oath fulfilled, his death witnessed by the trembling king beside him. The true cross, the most sacred relic of Christendom, believed to be a fragment of the actual cross of Christ, carried into battle as a talisman of divine protection, was now in Muslim hands. It would never be returned. To this day, its location is unknown. The road to Jerusalem was open. Now, before we reach the walls of the Holy City itself, we want to know, what do you think of Saladin's decision to execute Reynald personally? Was that the act of a man fulfilling a sacred oath, or a calculated message to every ruler in the region? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters. What followed the Battle of Hattin was, by any measure, stunning. Within weeks, Saladin's forces swept through the Kingdom of Jerusalem like a tide across a flat shore. Acre fell, Jaffa fell, Caesarea, Nablus, Sidon, Beirut, city after city, castle after castle. The infrastructure of nearly a century of Crusader presence collapsed in the space of a summer. By the first weeks of September, Saladin controlled virtually everything except a handful of isolated fortresses, the port city of Tyre, and one final singular prize, Jerusalem itself. Inside Jerusalem, there were perhaps 60,000 people, possibly more. The city had swelled to bursting with refugees fleeing the territories that had already fallen. Farmers, merchants, women, children, the elderly, the clergy. Among them were perhaps a few dozen actual knights capable of bearing arms. It was a city without defenders in any meaningful military sense. And it was a city without a commander. Enter Balian of Ibelin. Balian was one of the very few senior nobles to have escaped the catastrophe at Hattin. He had reached Tyre, where the surviving Crusaders were consolidating. But his wife, Maria Komnene, the former queen of Jerusalem, was trapped in Jerusalem with their children. He went to Saladin himself and asked for safe passage to retrieve his family. What happened next illuminates something essential about both men. Saladin granted the request. He gave Balian safe conduct to enter Jerusalem, spend one night, collect his family, and leave on one condition. Balian was not to take up arms against him. It was the agreement of two men who understood each other across the line of war. But when Balian arrived in Jerusalem, the city's inhabitants, thousands of terrified people with no leader, no general, no hope, fell to their knees before him. The patriarch, the queen, the clergy, the refugees, all begged him to stay and lead the defense. They told him that a Christian knight could not abandon them to their fate. They offered to absolve him of his oath to Saladin, arguing that the needs of Christendom superseded any promise made to an enemy.
Balian was a man of deep personal honor. He was also a man who could read a situation with cold clarity. He agreed to stay. He sent a message to Saladin explaining what had happened and why he could not keep his promise. In an extraordinary act, Saladin not only accepted the explanation, but personally ensured the safe passage of Balian's wife and children to Tripoli, honoring his commitment even when Balian could not honor his. Then the siege began. Saladin had offered generous terms before the first stone was thrown. The inhabitants could leave freely in exchange for surrendering the city. The delegation from Jerusalem refused, saying the city was sacred and they would not hand it over under any condition. Saladin vowed to take it by force. From September 20th, his siege engines began their work. Catapults, mangonels, Greek fire, waves of archers, the full weight of a medieval Islamic army in its prime pressed against Jerusalem's ancient walls. And yet the city held. Balian had performed near miracles of organization. He had knighted able-bodied tradesmen and merchants to build a fighting force of several hundred improvised soldiers. He had secured food and water. He had organized the civilian population into a disciplined defense. For 6 days, every assault was repulsed. On September 26th, Saladin shifted his forces to the northern wall near the Damascus Gate, where the approaches gave his siege weapons a more effective angle. The battering was relentless. On September 29th, his sappers successfully mined a section of the wall. It collapsed. Saladin's troops poured through the breach and were pushed back, but the writing was on the wall in every sense. There were no more men to defend the gap. The city was exhausted. And then came the conversation that neither side would ever forget. Balian rode out through the remains of the walls and asked to speak with Saladin. The exchange that followed, as recorded by the Arab historian Ibn al-Athir, who was present in the Sultan's retinue, was direct and extraordinary. Balian told Saladin that Jerusalem held a multitude of people whose numbers only God could count. He told him that as long as there was life left in a single defender, they would fight. And then he made a threat that stopped the Sultan's calculations cold.
If Saladin would not grant safe passage to every person in the city, the defenders would destroy it. They would slaughter their own families rather than see them enslaved. They would tear down the Muslim holy places stone by stone. They would burn everything of value, and then they would come out through the breach and die fighting, taking as many of Saladin's men with them as they could. The city would be a ruin, and Saladin would inherit nothing but ash. The threat was credible. Saladin knew it. He also knew what the memory of 1099 had meant to the Muslim world. He had built his entire campaign on that memory. But he was not a man of blind vengeance. He was a man who understood that mercy, strategically deployed, was a more powerful weapon than massacre. A massacre would unite Christendom against him in fury, as it had done a century before. A measured, honorable conquest would tell a different story to the Muslim world, to the Christian world, and to history. Negotiations continued for days. Saladin's initial terms, ransom payments for safe passage, were adjusted and readjusted as Balian argued the impossible mathematics of poverty. There were tens of thousands who could never pay. Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, came forward and asked his own brother to gift him 1,000 of the poor Christians as a gesture of freedom. Saladin agreed. Then Balian and the Patriarch of Jerusalem were each gifted several hundred more. And then Saladin, without announcement, simply ordered the release of all the elderly who could not pay. On October 2nd, 1187, Balian of Ibelin handed over the keys to the Tower of David. Saladin's army entered Jerusalem peacefully. The great golden Christian cross that had stood over the Dome of the Rock was pulled down. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was cleansed with rose water, its carpets replaced, its Qibla restored. Muslim prayer resounded through a city that had not heard it in 88 years.
Not a massacre, not a sack. A conquest so measured and so deliberate that even Christian chroniclers of the period were compelled to acknowledge the honor of the man who had carried it out. Ernul, a squire of Balian who witnessed the surrender firsthand, wrote simply, "Balian, seeing that the city could not be held, sought mercy, and Saladin granted it, for he was a man of great honor, though our people departed with heavy hearts." The news reached Pope Gregory VIII within weeks. He issued a papal bull calling for a new crusade to reclaim the city. It is said that his predecessor, Pope Urban III, had already died of grief upon learning of the fall of Hattin, before even hearing of Jerusalem's loss. All of Europe was shaken. But the question that history has never fully resolved is this: was Saladin's mercy a reflection of his genuine moral character, a man who truly believed that power came with the obligation of justice? Or was it the cold calculation of a brilliant politician who understood that the story of a merciful conquest was worth more than any amount of looted gold? The answer, perhaps, is that it was both, and that the fusion of the two, the genuinely principled man and the masterful strategist, is precisely what made Saladin unlike almost anyone else his age had produced.
He died in Damascus in March 1193, 6 years after taking Jerusalem. He had spent those years fighting a grinding war against the Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart of England, a conflict that ended not in victory for either side, but in a negotiated truce that left Jerusalem in Muslim hands, while allowing unarmed Christian pilgrims to visit. His enemies called him noble. Richard, who never met him in person but corresponded with him through intermediaries, purportedly said that the world had never seen two such princes as himself and Saladin. It was the highest compliment one warrior could offer another. When Saladin died, his friends discovered that the most powerful and most generous ruler in the Muslim world had not left enough money in his treasury to pay for his own grave. He had given it all away. What remains of Saladin after 9 centuries is not a monument or a treasury. It is a question.
one of the most profound that history ever poses. Can a conqueror also be just? Can power and mercy truly coexist in a single human being? And what does it mean in a world that celebrates force above all else when a man chooses a different path, not out of weakness, but out of strength? The conquest of Jerusalem in 1187 was not only a military victory, it was a statement about what kind of world Saladin believed was possible. A world where sacred places belonged to all who revered them, where the defeated were not erased but preserved, where an oath given to an enemy was kept, even when the enemy could not keep his own. History is full of conquerors, the ones we remember with complexity, with ambivalence, with something close to admiration across the centuries, are rare. Saladin is one of them. We genuinely want to know what you think. Was Saladin's mercy a sign of true moral greatness or a masterpiece of political strategy? Does the distinction even matter? Leave your answer in the comments below. If this story moved you, if it made you see the past in a different light, please subscribe to this channel. There are more stories like this one waiting. Stories of empires, of betrayals, of figures whose lives shook the foundations of the world. You should not miss a single one. And when this video ends, do not stop here. The next documentary is already waiting for you. A new story, a new world, a new truth buried by time, ready to be uncovered. Thank you from the bottom of this project's heart for staying with this story until its very last word. The best is always yet to come.